Professor Ulrike FELT, speaking about extending our understanding of responsible innovation.
I'm going to speak about the topic of innovation residues and extending our understanding of responsible innovation. I would like to thank, first of all, Paulius for preparing all that, but above all the Institut d'Études Avancées in Paris for being able to spend here in this really nice and seeming luxurious office I can spend for the next month. Also, good afternoon to everybody who is joining online. It's a real pleasure to be part of this conversation and to share some of the questions and tensions I'm currently grappling with around the themes of innovation and responsibility. And my argument today is that debates around responsible innovation have not yet fully addressed the increasing complexities and entanglements of contemporary innovation systems, but have stayed a bit stuck in an understanding of innovation as a single technology that sees life and moves out into the world. As such, I believe we need a more profound rethinking of what responsible innovation could and should mean. One of that approaches innovation through different conceptual and methodological lenses. And I come to this as a scholar in science and technology studies. I'm working at the University of Vienna at a Department of Science and Technology Studies. And I'm deeply interested for many, many years in how science, technology, and society actually cohabitate this planet. And what I'll share today draws on work that is part of a 5-year ERC Advanced Grant project entitled Innovation Residues, Modes and Infrastructures of Caring for Our Longue Durée Environmental Futures. More about that in a moment. And now, yes. So before turning directly to the question of responsible innovation, it is important to first situate the discussion within a broader socio-political and cultural context in which it actually unfolds. And in Europe and increasingly across other industrialized regions, we are operating in a moment where continuous innovation is not only encouraged, but framed as essential to societal survival in that sense. The prevailing narrative suggests that to fail to innovate is to risk stagnation, irrelevance, or even collapse. We are called to think out of the box, to produce more and faster innovations, and give birth to specific futures, shaping tomorrow today, as this nice slogan says on the picture below, and be ready to identify and support the next generation of innovations, so the cover of a report published in the context of the World Economic Forum indicates. The climate has given rise to what might be described as an area of engaged innovationism. So a condition marked less by genuine curiosity or reflexive experimentation and more by a pervasive compulsion towards novelty production. Innovation becomes then, in that sense, a normative expectation, a kind of societal obligation. As a result, we have increasingly come to treat innovation not as a means to a specific end, but as an end in itself, a self-reinforcing imperative that often escapes scrutiny, even as it shapes institutions, economies, and ecological relationships, and in the end, the kinds of lives that we all can live. So let's take a closer look. When we analyze discourses around fields of innovation, a striking pattern emerges. A kind of specialized vocabulary has evolved to sustain the momentum of progress. We are urged to foster, accelerate, incubate, disrupt, or whatever the notions are called, relentlessly driving forward in pursuit of the next breakthrough. Alongside this, a substantial body of scholarship, particularly in my field, science and technology studies, but well beyond, has critically examined the dynamics of innovation regimes, including their governance, regulatory structures, and societal implications. To assure alignment with our societal values, we have put in place a number of procedures over the last 50 years, ranging from technology assessment, co-creation practices, value-sensitive design, we have a proliferation of living labs, citizen science, and the development of a framework called responsible innovation, which was very much pushed by the European Commission over the last 15 to 20 years. All intended to assure, so the hope is an alignment of technological development with broader societal values. Yes, they are only what I want to call punctual interventions of care. It expresses the idea that care is isolated and momentary and often disconnected from the broader or from the ongoing responsibilities along the journey of any innovation. It highlights how care is performed at a critical moment, either during design or the launch of an innovation or the policy declarations. We currently see that with artificial intelligence, but not maintained as a continuous practice. Fields of innovation are wrapped into a flurry of promissory futures, the architects of these futures remaining often very unclear. Who designs them, in whose name, and who is supposed to benefit from them? When things go wrong, we find discourses of the so-called unintended consequences, a term that deserves really critical interrogation for the way it frames complexity, deflects agency, and obscures accountability within innovation processes. And when looking at how fields of innovation make their way into society, they branch out in multiple directions. These are the big arrows in my graphic, and embark on journeys through space and time, shaping society, while for sure also being to a certain degree shaped by it. Along these trajectories, however, innovations also leave behind what I call innovation residues. So the leftovers, often enduring remnants of innovations passages. These include overflows, fallout, or straightforwardly waste, persisting long after the production, use, or consumption of the innovation that it comes from. In doing so, they give rise to what I call collateral futures, so futures not part of the sales pitch, marked by new kinds of inequalities, exclusions, and environmental degradation. To confront this, the first step for me is to think about methodological and conceptual shifts that are needed, rather than viewing innovation from the present and projecting it forward. We must read innovation in reverse, through the lens of looking at residues. It is in these traces, these material and symbolic leftovers, that the full story of innovation and its broader implications for society comes into view, and it is essential to incorporate these residues when pondering over the value of specific innovations. So at the heart of my project is my concept of innovation residues, the often overlooked material, infrastructural, and ecological remnants that linger in the wake of technological process. Moving beyond the conventional category of waste, the project opens up to new conceptual pathways for understanding left behinds more generally, through the lens of fallout, so the diffuse and cumulative and spatially uneven process of distribution that extend well beyond the point of production and use. Crucially, by linking these residues to innovation processes rather than to specific only products or technologies alone, the project adopts a more systemic perspective, one that interrogates the afterlives of these complex innovation processes and choices, and challenges also these broader socio-technical imaginaries that are embedded in them. Central to this inquiry is an exploration of what I call modes and infrastructures of care. So how do we look after these residues? What do we put in place to do so? And along the way, how we roll out innovations, and how societies attend or actually fail to attend to the residues that innovations generate is a really important question of responsibility. This requires a more refined understanding of what responsibility might mean, one that foregrounds the material, cultural, and political practices involved in caring across diverse contexts. So I have to ask when, where, how, and who cares for these residues, and who has to carry the burden of that. The project therefore seeks to conceptualize and trace specific forms of residual care, exploring how such care is unequally distributed and variably enacted. And underlying these investigations is a concern with the longue durée environmental futures, because the main point is that futures have become extremely short-term. They have roughly taken up 2 legislative periods, that's it, but not much more, while the impact of residues go often over hundreds of years, as I will show with my examples. The project interrogates how the different forms of collateral futures are brought into being, how temporalities of care and harm unfold, and how dominant future imaginary, particularly in my case, I study nuclear plastics and digital domains, are often captivated, so caught by the entrenched logics of the present. Does it serve me now? Empirically, as I said already shortly, the project is grounded in the study of 3 domains of innovation that have profoundly shaped the world since mid-20th century: nuclear technology, plastics, and more recently, the digital transformations. Each of these fields emerged and continues to evolve and emerge within the frame of highly promissory narratives, and we just lived through such a phase in the nuclear, promising progress, security, convenience, or connectivity. Yet each also generates a significant legacy of material residues, both direct and indirect, that challenge these narratives and demand renewed ethical and political attention. In the nuclear realm, we encounter enduring residues such as radioactive waste, which is obviously addressed, but we also have diverse kinds of fallouts, vast decommissioned infrastructures, and wastelands rendered uninhabitable. In the case of plastics, the residues are pervasive, ranging from micro and nanoplastics, leading to broader ecological disruptions, even in the remotest corner of the world. And it also touches our bodies, as nanoparticles have entered all our most vital organs. It would thus be suitable to speak of a plastic fallout, a diffuse, persistent, and globally distributed entity. Digital transformations as a third field, while often presented as immaterial or clean, produce multiple very material residues in form of mining byproducts for the critical raw materials needed in the digital infrastructure, e-waste, data waste, so all these data that are collected, stored, kept alive, and at our disposition, but never really used again. And the mediated effects of energy consumption required to sustain infrastructures of connectivity. Here we could see nuclear waste as a mediated form of digital residue. The digital fallout is no less material despite the rhetoric of virtuality that surrounds it. In all 3 cases, these residues are not only physical, but also epistemically and politically to be managed, frequently rendered, however, invisible or pushed to the periphery through a technical reframing, spatial displacement, or systematic deferral into the future. The promise we will have a technological solution when time comes has been around for more than 50 years, and apparently the time has not yet come. And yet these remnants persist, accumulate, and must be confronted as matters of concern, and ideally refigured as matters of care, so to look after them. This reframing opens the door for new forms of thinking about responsibility that need to be more attuned to the spatiotemporal and affective dimensions of innovation's afterlives. Let us for a moment interrogate innovation's entanglement with the environment, seeking to critically balance its celebrated achievements against its often overlooked ecological costs. So crucially, I approach this inquiry in a situated manner, attentive to specific context, politics, and epistemic framings. I'm particularly staying in the European context. I'm looking comparatively at different national contexts in that sense to see also differences and to better understand the conditions of how innovation is narrated and assessed. I pose 3 interrelated questions for today. First, what kinds of innovation residues does a given innovation actually produce? So the material, the infrastructure, the ecological remnants are left in this wake. Second, I'm interested in the regimes of invisibility that are at work in managing, deflecting, or deferring, as I said already, sustained public and scholarly engagement with these environmental effects. And third, I'm interested in the temporalities that govern this relation between innovation and the environment, whose timeframes are prioritized and which are ignored and marginalized. For example, in the name that we need innovation immediately. All domains of innovation generate residues. Some are formally acknowledged as waste, which means that they follow some form of a definition and classification, and often also regulation. Examples are nuclear waste, classic plastic waste, but also e-waste. That it doesn't work is needless to say. Not really work or work to a different degree is needless to say. Drawing on Joe Masco's notion of fallout, I understand some of these residues as these unexpected supplements of innovation events, slow-moving, often imperceptible, and deeply cumulative. Fallout is mobile, diffuse, and accretive, linking human activity, technological infrastructures, and ecological systems into new configurations of contamination. These harms are not only difficult to trace, they are also hard to govern, as they frequently manifest through the temporal displacement of injury. So environmental degradation and health risks are often shifted into a future, becoming legible only when ecosystems or human health are already destabilized. This is clearly visible in the case of microplastics, which has, despite already known around the 70s, it has been elegantly ignored until the beginning of the 21st century. And the metaphor of fallout thus foregrounds not only the material afterlines of innovation, such as e-waste or contaminated landscapes from extraction practices, but also the broader epistemic and atmospheric conditions that shape whether and how such residues are noticed. So whether we are capable to develop what Anna Tsing has nicely called the arts of noticing them. And so to understand why these residues often remain unattended and thus behind the smoke screen, I turn to 2 complementary concepts. The one of strategic ignorance, and the other, the phenomenon of being hidden in plain sight. While they may appear similar, each captures a distinct mode of rendering environmental harm invisible. Lindsay McGoey defines strategic industry, not a strategic ignorance, not as simple absence of knowledge, but she embeds it in organizational culture and systemic incentives. By contrast, when you look at Eviatar Zerubbabel's work, he emphasizes the inattention that is socially organized. So it's not accidental, but it's a cultural pattern in his view. And according to Zerubbabel, entire groups may tacitly agree not to acknowledge certain realities, not because they are unknown, but because they are collectively socialized into habits of silence. What we observe then are not incidental gaps in awareness, but socially and politically constructed modes of erasure. While Zerubbabel highlights the cultural scripts of denial, McGowan helps me to expose institutional logics that incentivize not knowing. Together, they allow us to understand how the environmental fallout of innovation remains obscured, deferred, dismissed, not in spite of modern knowledge systems, but brought through them. In returning to my question of responsibility, I propose an expanded conceptualization, which I would like to label spatiotemporal geographies of responsibility. In an area of accelerated globalization, responsibility can no longer be confined to the local or immediate context, which is very often the case. It must be understood as unfolding across space and time, entangled in shifting terrains of power, of movement, and of consequences. To develop this concept, I draw inspiration from two thinkers who emerged from very distinct intellectual traditions. On the one hand, Madeleine Eckeridge, working within the actor network theory tradition. She has famously argued that technical objects are always scripted, embedding within them specific expectations, roles, and forms of agency. And importantly, she notes, and this is important for my thinking of responsibility, that these scripts contain and produce a specific geography of responsibilities. While she does not further elaborate on her understanding of geography, I take this insight as a starting point to extend the idea of scripting into broader fields of innovation, not just as a technical or design issue, but as a spatial and moral one. For me, the notion of geography is thus not limited to a physical territory. It gestures towards the multidimensionality of responsibility, spatial, temporal, ethical, affective. It highlights that responsibility is always relational, distributed across actors, places, infrastructures, and temporalities. My second point stems from Ajahn Apatorai, a cultural and social anthropologist work, whose theory of global scapes, he calls them. He speaks of 5 scapes, so ethno, techno, finance, media, and ideascapes, and that this exposes the fragmented yet deeply interconnected flows that configure the global condition. These disjunctive scapes generates spatial and temporal asymmetries. So while capital and technology aim at moving and accelerating velocity, people, practices, ideologies are often subject to some form of inertia or delayed reaction. This unevenness challenges linear and very localized understandings of ethical responsibility. For instance, environmental destruction precipitated by financial decisions in one region may manifest only decades later and thousands of miles away, implicating actors who may never directly witness the harm they have enabled. Apatorai's framework thus underscores the necessity of spatio-temporal ethics, one that acknowledges the multiscalar, relational, and deferred nature of global consequences. To meaningfully engage with responsibility and innovation, we thus must attend to its entangled geographies of responsibility, what might be called the timescapes, the landscapes, and the socioscapes of responsibility. Timescapes reminds us that responsibility is not merely an immediate act, but something that has to unfold and persist across time, encompassing both historical legacies and obligations to future generations. Landscapes, meanwhile, draw attention to the material and symbolic dimensions of space, the environmental impacts of innovation, the power relations embedded in place, and the demands of spatial justice and place-based accountability. And socioscape, to take the last part, foregrounds the social and political terrain through which responsibility moves, emphasizing questions of equity, access, and the uneven distribution of harms and benefits across communities and across generations. Together, the scapes compel us to ask where, when, who, towards whom, and how is responsibility exercised. These are not one-time reflections, but questions that must be embedded throughout the entire process of innovation, from conception to implementation and beyond. Only by acknowledging the multidimensional entanglement can we move forward more just, responsive, and situated practices of responsibility. By embedding responsibility within these shifting landscapes and timescapes and socioscapes, we can begin to envision a more just and responsive framework of responsibility, capable of addressing not only local stakeholders, so the ones that vote for me, but distant others and future generations as well. In that sense, any inquiry into innovation and its governance must begin by posing a set of critical questions that tie the way we value innovation to the question of responsibility. First, it is essential to ask who is entitled to express valuation, so to express what is valuable, in what capacity they do so, and with what authority. Are they speaking as experts, policymakers, whatsoever? Moreover, it is necessary to examine which dimensions of an innovation become central to these valuations, and which aspects are rendered invisible or marginal. See my initial reflections on the regimes of invisibility. And this, of course, these assessments do not occur in a vacuum. They are always addressed to someone. So who then are the intended addressees of these valuations? And how does that shape their form and content? Do we need to tell that to citizens in order to follow us in the innovation business? Such evaluative practices unfold within the broader socio-political context in which certain orders of worth, moral, technical, economic, are more dominant or legitimate than others, often privileging particular voices while excluding others. This raises the further question of what kinds of legitimate resources, discursive, institutional, material, different actors can actually draw upon in order to be heard. In some, understanding how valuation functions requires a careful analysis of power, authority, visibility, and legitimacy in complex innovation landscapes. So here are my non-entirely concluding thoughts, and I have a month to go, so to maybe finish thinking that. To critically engage with innovation, it is thus not sufficient to focus solely on its objects. We want to push the objects we want to get through, we want to implement, we want to sell, and to these kind of expected outcomes. Instead, we have to be attentive to the journeys these innovations take, the spatial, the temporal, and the social trajectories through which innovations move, mutate, and tangle with society. This approach makes visible the uneven geographies and temporalities of impact, including the residues, material, social, and ecological, that are often ignored or externalized. As Donna Haraway urges us, responsibility must be reconfigured as responsibility. So a situated ability, a capacity to respond meaningfully and accountably to others, humans and non-humans alike. This means moving beyond bureaucratic or instrumental understandings of responsible innovation as a checklist and a one-time engagement with society, or as a straightforward compliance with rules. It means accompanying innovations in their journey through society, re-asking questions that seem to have reached closure. Such a deformularization, though frequently met with institutional resistance as it hinders speedy and smooth innovation, opens space for more careful experimentation, be it collective or singular, and repeated reflexivity, and a commitment to stay with the trouble, as Haraway has formulated so convincingly. Developing modes and infrastructures of caring then means being attentive to the neglected things, to the residues of innovation, not allowing us to forget, to hide, or to ignore them. However, we should not underestimate the power of such formularizations of innovation assessment or critical reflection. Peter Becker, a cultural historian, has very nicely spoken of the discrete charm of the form, eloquently explaining that the appreciation for the subtle yet institutionally compelling allure that lies within this particular formularized structure. Beyond the seeming mundane and rigid exterior, Becker highlights how such form-like documents as ethics screenings or even some of the more participatory procedures, they carry a subtle elegance and functional beauty. This charm lies in their ability to systematize complex processes, even though they impoverish them deeply from their complexity. And that is how they can stay in place. What appears banal at first glance, so these ritualistic assessments of the worth of innovations, so speaking only of energy consumption in our data practices and ignoring the raw material residues and the livelihood of people and the many sites that are destroyed because of the mines, may reveal upon closer inspection the power relations embedded in the design and purposes of our ethical reflections, of our responsibility. In doing so, we challenge in the Innovation Residues project the dominant narratives that cast innovation as an unproblematic trajectory towards progress, a future that is often only bright for some, but that does not contain its collateral neighbors. Instead, it is essential to begin to imagine and enact more plural, contested, and inclusive futures. Maybe it is an uncomfortable way to address these innovations that come with so attractive worlds that it promises to us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ulrike. I know Mathilde had written me in the chat. I see Angela, and yes, we'll start with Mathilde, Angela, and then Sadi.
Thank you for such a insightful talk. It was really wonderful. My comment is about the types of wastes you're interested in. It seems like your project is about general technological scientific innovation waste for which are constructed are toxic and dangerous. And so producers want to escape their ownership or liability. And here, I'm talking as a legal scholar, and I'm also really interested in whether you're planning to include bodily waste in your project, because it seems to me that one of the ways in which contemporary, or at least modern or recent medicine and biomedicine is distinctive is that it creates a lot of bodily waste through remnants of surgeries, blood work, birth, and that there's unlike for regular innovation waste where the producers or the technical scientific people want to escape their ownership and liability, in the body context there's a rush to acquire rights over these wastes and reuse them, while excluding the people from whom, blood or cells or placentas were extracted from being able to control them. And so I'd love to hear whether that's something you're interested in and how you think about it.
Yeah, I respond, Paulius? Can I? Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Thanks a lot, Mathilde. Actually, I've been thinking a lot about bodily waste, not in the context of this project, but as I have been working a lot on biobanking and other things, it is absolutely fascinating to see how how the language of waste is kind of turned as you need it. If you want material from people, I have been observing people calling it waste. That would be, so give it to me because it would be wasted otherwise. So it's a revaluing process in order to make people feel that they create value through sharing. And this is a very, very interesting topic. But here, in at least the parts I've seen in the medical field, it's interesting that they differentiate between waste that they can bring into that they can create value with, and waste they don't want to see. And it's kind of interesting which kinds of waste are made invisible and which kinds of waste are actually embedded in a value discourse. And this divide is actually an interesting divide, which we now see also for the data field, where so far the idea that data is waste, it can be waste, is not very easily acceptable to data people. And only very gradually I see that. And when I say, in order to keep data alive, this is a very costly piece of work, because I need to store them, I need to feed them, etc., etc. So if I never use them, they are in a way dead bodies of data. And so it's kind of interesting. We still need resources. So it's interesting how we do not acknowledge certain kind of, and I particularly developed this idea of the metabolism with regard to data, to bring it closer to how we think about human bodies and how we think about data bodies in relationship. So so in my current project, I'm really looking at these three fields, and I want to go beyond waste, because unfortunately certain things like microplastic is never called waste. It's not categorized as waste. And so it could live easily and peacefully for many, many decades because we just did not classify or look at it. And so the question is like, when does something become a particular category is an important question of classification. Sorry, I could go on. This is a really interesting topic. We should speak about that.
Wonderful. Thank you. Angela, next.
Hi, Ulrike. It's nice to see you again. As you know, residues are very close to my own heart, given the book that I published on the topic a few years ago with Soraya Boudia and others.
Yes.
And my question was very close to Mathilde's, which is really, I mean, in our book, we have a lot to say about why residues are ignored, namely that to acknowledge them, and especially if they're toxic, if they become toxic waste, they go from being valueless to extremely expensive. Because environmental remediation is ordinarily extraordinarily expensive. So I was, in some ways, you already began to answer this with Mathilde, but I wanted to ask you a little bit more about how economic considerations shape what counts as a residue, what counts as waste, what doesn't count at all because of the cost. Thanks.
Yeah, Angela, the residues book is a really important resource. Looking at specific kinds of residues, what I was interested is to bring the innovation conceptualization, so the innovation discourse in conversation with the residues. And that's why I call it innovation residues, because it tries to understand the systemic part of it and to not necessarily focus on the specific features of a residue, but to look at really where is it left behind and how long can it remain lingering somewhere, and when does it become named? Like in microplastic, it's so interesting. As long as it was called little pieces of plastic, nobody cared. The moment the term microplastic appeared in early 21st century, suddenly somebody said, oh, this is an entity in itself. But it's still unclear what it is. It's a leftover. It's unclear how toxic it is, and is it really fully toxic? And so it's this lingering I'm interested in, and who are the players that try to keep it undefined and thus unactionable in many ways. And so that's a bit the kind of angle I'm trying to take. And I think the work you have done together with others on more the question of toxicity also and materiality is really important, and to have this kind of material approach. But I think it's important to, because we live in this innovation society imaginary, I think it's important to look at it more on a kind of systemic basis, if you want so, and to look at how this innovation discourse and the innovation imaginary can produce these spaces for left behinds without consideration.
Thank you. Sadi, next.
Well, thank you very much, Ulrike. I had two comments or questions. I don't know. The first one is about the data. And I think that there are two aspects. There's the material aspect about, like disk space of all these images we keep or whatever on the networks. And the other one is data poisoning, right? And so I think that this notion could be developed in a very interesting way, because it's an epistemic crime, right? So if you put something that is wrong, you're polluting the epistemic space, and this should become a crime. And I think there could be a lot of good directions in there, because in terms of legal liability. The other one is more generic, and it's about the role of science in there. Okay. And so, the problem you're pointing at is basically externalities, but unexpected externalities, right? And the fact is that it's a distributed production of these externalities, which makes responsibility difficult to attribute, and also they're found ex post, right? Which is not really what the aspect that economic theory hasn't really been working on. And so our current method of assessing responsibility is to try to find somebody who's responsible. That's the fundamental attribution bias. We always want one actor to be responsible, but here it's a systemic production, right? The other thing is that it's after the fact. right? And so it's very difficult to prevent this. So we can only have some kind of insurential approach to this, right? And so my suggestion is that since you need prevention, is why not? And it's science will be able to look at the repair and how to do things, which is what matters. How do we deal with these things when we discover after the fact? And so I would suggest some kind of innovation tax, right? To fund science. Is that if you want, I mean, as long as you do research and explore, that's fine. But if you put something out there in the world, you should pay for the risk that you're introducing, right? And so if you go to the market, you have to pay this innovation tax, and then this would fund science, and that would help science explore a lot of these things, and probably help the evaluation ex post when people are trying to do some innovation. Because the problem is always that how do we fund this research to figure out if the precautionary principle, I mean, it's not just to refuse, but we want to explore. And so the other good aspect of such innovation tax is that it would slow down innovation. And I think that's something that we really need to do. Right?
Yeah, wow. Big questions. Maybe a very short answer. I actually was a lot thinking about the toxicity of data. And so I like the idea of data poisoning, because actually it's this whole creation of an artificial overflow where you can feed into data that are uncontrollable due to the pure mass of them is also an interesting feature. And we rely, for example, I've been long discussing that in medicine even. We also want people to collect their own data and then feed them into the data body, and then seriously thinking about how much of that is artificially selected and created, and how much we can learn from it, and how much. And so this is not even the worst cases, which you could also think is about deliberate poisoning by feeding into data that destroy our capacity to recognize certain things. And I think about also the destruction we are living from with data now, right now in the US, is an interesting way that even by reducing data, you can also create kind of side effects that limit kind of epistemological insights. I find it interesting in the microplastic case that the first paper appeared in Science in 1972. And it says very clearly, there are these small plastic particles in the sea. And if we continue to expand the plastic industry and have no system of recovery, this will be a massive problem. It took 30 years until the first people started to care about it. And so it's interesting. It's in the highest impact journal. It's very clear, people see it. And it's still something, we are so much committed to this idea of not disturbing a functioning industry that creates wealth and that promises a better life, that disturbance is seen as a destructive and not a positive destructive side. So the innovation tax is interesting because what we do right now is we take away taxes in order to foster innovation. So we do exactly the reverse to what you suggest. We kind of say we need more because that's the only way we can survive. And so I do see your point, but I do think that what we really need is we need to accompany innovations more and to keep them under a certain kind of surveillance. And we have really right now a one-stop-go ethical procedure. Whatever, call it technology assessment, call it. I mean, you can look at all of them. And even if I would sign up for some of them, I still see that they're only at one point in time they are done. They get a tick box and we don't ask questions anymore. And I think we need to move away when we see how the bifurcations that innovations create, which we have not necessarily been thinking about, where all these things go. And I think with AI, we just live it every moment, how that creeps down into the lives of little children, etc., the way we consume information and we connect and think. And so, yes, and it cannot no longer be a simple question of a single liability. I think we need other concepts, and I'm trying to struggle a bit with that and think it through. That's a bit my little project or my little big project.
Great. Thank you. We have some minutes left. I see Carola, and there was one question in the chat I'll read next.
Yes, thanks a lot. Great, interesting, fascinating presentation. I have a very concrete question. I always felt like you're introducing my talk from Tuesday, upcoming Tuesday. So
I'm looking forward to it. So
thanks for preparing. Value-sensitive design, all of that is going to come again. But I'm always talking about landscape, obviously coming from the socioscape we've heard. So so this three-sum, it's a very concrete question. This three-sum, has that been conceptualized by someone, or is this yours? So to put them in the three together.
In a way, I try. I mean, I have not read anything that really systematically does that. So there is a very good body of literature on timescapes. Okay. I've been using that personally a lot. That comes more from sociology of time, and has also been nicely linked to the environment. So people like Barbara Adam, etc. There are people who have been working on this landscape topic, but that's much more diverse. And I think that the trick lies in opening up the right dimensions to see how they interact with each other, and ask it with regard to this question of distributed responsibility and answers to it. And I think that's for me the point. And the socioscape is for me a bit what Apatorai calls the ideoscape, but it's not exactly the same for me, because I also want to bring in much more the social layeredness of affectedness in one place. So it's not just distributed across the globe, but it's also the layeredness. And that's why I used I tried to explain the three concepts in ways how they tie together.
Yeah, no, I find it really, landscape is obviously something I'm dealing with all the time, and I've been using Appadurai's scape.
Exactly.
Really need to look into the temporal scape, because I've been working through time and temporality, but not through that lens. So thanks, and to be continued. I don't want to take the time.
Oh yes, looking forward to hear your presentation on Tuesday.
Great. Perfect. And then maybe a couple of minutes, there was one in the chat saying, curious as to whether innovation inherently has moved to include community engagement and co-creation. Does society even value about the innovation in the first place? And the broader co-creation, for example, intersectorally would help the view of waste very differently, maybe treasure to another.
Yeah, it's a very complex question, because of course everybody uses these kinds of methodologies in one way or another. I am increasingly concerned about that, because it becomes a gesture. It's not an in-depth, very often an in-depth engagement. In particular, it does not work very well in my case. It works extremely well when you have a very specific technology which needs to be adapted and kind of has a user, a kind of very concrete group of users that need to be aligned with it. And I think it makes extremely sense, and people are also interested in working on that. I've seen that in the medical field a lot, for example. But the moment you get into more complex relationships, like in innovation, then all these methodologies have a huge difficulty in scaling and in temporalizing, so in keeping it up over time, because that would be extremely considerable investment in. And in that sense, I agree that people would not want on a continuous basis to kind of work on these kinds of questions, but have turned into consumers of these innovations, always in the hope that somebody else will take care of what it means, and not ready to see the impacts that this might cause across the globe. And so this question of locality and globality is one that is, it's constant, in the sense that innovation is profoundly thought global, and at the same time it impacts very differently in different locations. And that's why I think this tension is important to address. But this is a huge, I've been working myself on these issues for many years, and I see many of the problems that they bring with them. And this question of scalability, simply and purely. What would be, for example, a living lab if you have a global problem? So how would a thing like that? And that works perfectly well if you have a very precise problem in a city, in an area about a problem, and then this works. And so the question is like, have we methods to scale up and to think about these complex relationships?
Yes, thank you. I see Carola has something. We have, a couple of minutes.
Yeah, I was just going to add on, because I think this question of scalability and what you just said about living labs is absolutely key. We have a project called Bauhaus of the Sea Sails, and lots of the colleagues are looking into locally grounded and very local specific problems. But all of these local specific problems usually emerge out of global flows of water, of goods, of people. So you have to constantly find a way in terms of scaling in and out in space, in time, and through stakeholders, because even this local, you can decide to flood a polder again and give land back to sea, but that's never local. So it's just a way of saying thank you, because I completely agree that we need to have these local global intersections more carefully spelled out.